Bobby Mitchell sealed his final love letter on December 1943, promising to marry Helen when he returned from his secret mission in the Pacific. 60 years later, she died still wearing the engagement ring he never got to give her. While 3 miles beneath the ocean, that same ring sat waiting in his sea bag aboard the USS Tempest. The pen felt heavy in Bobby Mitchell's calloused hands as he sat at the small metal desk in his cramped quarters aboard the USS Tempest. Outside his porthole, the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars, but Bobby's mind was thousands of miles away in a small apartment in San Diego, where Helen Martinez was probably getting ready for her shift at the aircraft factory. He'd started this letter 3 times already, crumpling up the previous attempts and tossing them into the wastebasket. How do you tell the woman you love that something feels different about this mission? How do you explain the knot in your stomach without sounding like a coward? Dearest Helen, he finally wrote, his careful script flowing across the Navy-issued paper. I hope this letter finds you safe and well. We're somewhere in the Pacific, can't say exactly where, but the sunsets out here remind me of that evening we spent at Sunset Cliffs before I shipped out. Remember how you said the ocean looked like it went on forever? Well, it does, sweetheart, it really does. Bobby paused, listening to the familiar sounds of the ship around him, the steady thrum of the engines, the distant chatter of his shipmates playing cards in the mess hall, the occasional bark of orders from the bridge. These sounds had become home to him over the past year, but tonight they felt different somehow. More final. I know I can't write much about what we're doing out here, he continued, but I wanted you to know that I think about you every single day. I think about that little house we talked about buying in Coronado, the one with the white picket fence and the garden where you wanted to grow tomatoes. I think about our wedding, about dancing with you while your father pretends he's not crying. The ship rolled gently in the swells, and Bobby steadied his hand on the paper. In his sea bag, wrapped carefully in an old handkerchief, was the engagement ring he'd bought with 3 months' pay. He'd been carrying it for 6 months now, waiting for the right moment, but moments like that were hard to come by in the middle of a war. Captain Morrison called a meeting earlier, Bobby wrote, his voice dropping to barely a whisper even though he was alone. Something about a special assignment. The way he looked at us, well, it reminded me of how my father looked at his hunting dogs before a particularly dangerous hunt. Proud, but worried too. He could hear footsteps in the corridor outside, probably Johnson making his rounds. Bobby glanced at his watch. 11:30 p.m., November 30th, 1943. Tomorrow they'd reach their destination, wherever that was. I need you to know something, Helen. If anything happens to me out here, if I don't make it home, I want you to live your life. Don't wait for a ghost. Find someone who makes you laugh, the way you used to laugh at my terrible jokes. But know that every wave I see out here carries my love back to you. As possibly. Bobby signed the letter, sealed it in an envelope, and placed it in the outgoing mailbox. 3 days later, the USS Tempest vanished without a trace. The morning of December 3rd, 1943, dawned clear and calm over the Pacific Ocean. Captain William Morrison stood on the bridge of the USS Tempest, watching his crew go about their morning routines with the practiced efficiency he'd come to expect from his men. After 18 months in the Pacific theater, the 186 sailors aboard his destroyer Escort had become a well-oiled machine. "Coffee, sir," Ensign Parker offered, holding out a steaming mug. Morrison accepted it gratefully, inhaling the bitter aroma that had become as essential to Navy life as salt air and diesel fuel. "Any word from command about our cargo inspection?" "All secure, Captain. Chief Ramirez reports the special equipment is properly stowed and monitored." Parker lowered his voice slightly. "The men are asking questions about what we're carrying." Morrison nodded grimly. He'd been asking the same questions himself, but Admiral Halsey's orders had been crystal clear. The Tempest was to transport the classified materials to coordinates that didn't appear on any standard naval charts, maintain complete radio silence during the mission, and ask no questions about their cargo. "Tell the men what I've told you," Morrison replied. "Need to know basis only. This cargo could help end the war sooner." By noon, the Tempest was making good time through moderate seas. Bobby Mitchell was on deck duty, swabbing down the port side when his friend Tommy Kowalski joined him. "You mail that letter to your girl?" Tommy asked, producing a cigarette from his pocket. "Last night," Bobby replied, wringing out his mop. "Should reach her by Christmas if we're lucky." Tommy lit his cigarette and took a long drag. "My Sarah's expecting our first baby in February. Keep thinking about that little one, wondering if I'll make it home to see him walk." "You will," Bobby said firmly. "We all will. This war can't last forever." At 1400 hours, the weather began to change. What had started as a gentle Pacific breeze turned into gusting winds that sent spray across the deck. Chief Ramirez ordered all non-essential personnel below as the swells grew larger. By 1600 hours, the Tempest was fighting through 8-foot waves. In the cargo hold, the mysterious crates began to shift despite their restraints. Morrison ordered additional securing, but the ship's unusual cargo made normal procedures difficult. "Sir," reported Lieutenant Commander Hayes from the engine room, "we're taking on water in the forward compartments. The cargo may have compromised our watertight integrity." Morrison felt ice in his veins. The classified nature of their mission meant they couldn't break radio silence to request assistance. They were completely alone in hostile waters with no way to call for help. At 1830 hours, the last entry was made in the ship's log. Heavy seas, cargo shifting, taking on water, maintaining radio silence per orders, all hands performing admirably under difficult circumstances. At 1900 hours, the USS Tempest simply disappeared from the face of the earth. No distress signal was ever sent. No wreckage was ever found. 186 men vanished into the Pacific, carrying their secrets with them into the depths. Helen Martinez was sorting mail at the aircraft factory when she saw the Western Union boy walking toward the main office. Every woman in the building knew what that yellow envelope meant. Someone's husband, brother, or sweetheart wasn't coming home. The chatter on the assembly line always stopped when those telegrams arrived. She didn't think it would be for her. Bobby was careful, and his ship was doing patrol duty in the rear areas, nothing dangerous like the Marines storming beaches. When her supervisor called her name over the factory loudspeaker, Helen's first thought was that her mother had fallen ill again. The telegram was brief and cold, typed on official Navy Department letterhead. "The Secretary of the Navy regrets to inform you that Seaman First Class Robert J. Mitchell is missing in action in the performance of his duty and in the service of his country." Letter follows. Helen read it 3 times before the words made sense. Missing in action. Not killed, not wounded, just missing. She clutched the yellow paper so tightly it crumpled in her hands. "Ma'am?" The supervisor touched her shoulder gently. "Would you like to go home?" Helen shook her head. Work was better than sitting alone in her apartment, wondering what missing in action really meant. She folded the telegram carefully and put it in her purse, then returned to her station installing instrument panels in fighter planes. 3 days later, Bobby's letter arrived. Helen's hands trembled as she opened the envelope, postmarked November 30th, 1943, 3 days before the Navy said he'd gone missing. His familiar handwriting filled 2 pages, and she could almost hear his voice speaking the words. The letter mentioned a special assignment, and something about the captain looking worried. Bobby had written about loving her and wanting her to live her life if something happened to him. He'd known something was wrong. Somehow, he'd known. Helen took the letter to the Navy recruitment office downtown, but the lieutenant there just gave her the same information she'd already received. The USS Tempest had been on routine patrol when contact was lost. Search and rescue operations were ongoing, but results were classified for security reasons. "Missing in action means there's still hope," the officer told her kindly. "Ships have been found before, crews rescued after weeks at sea." But weeks turned into months, and no news came. Helen wrote letters to admirals, congressmen, anyone with enough rank to demand answers. The responses were always the same. Due to the classified nature of the mission, no additional information could be provided. The families of the 186 missing sailors would be notified if circumstances changed. If stories like this move you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share in the comments where you're watching from. Mrs. Kowalski from Oakland called Helen in February. Tommy's wife Sarah had given birth to their son, but there was still no word about the Tempest. They formed a telephone network with other families, sharing whatever scraps of information they could gather. The official story never changed. The USS Tempest had been lost at sea during routine operations. In a war where ships disappeared regularly and thousands of young men died every month, one missing destroyer escort barely rated a paragraph in the newspapers. But Helen kept Bobby's letter, and she kept asking questions that nobody seemed willing to answer. Helen Martinez refused to remove Bobby's photographs from her apartment walls. While other war brides packed away memories and tried to move forward, Helen kept his coffee cup on the kitchen table and his favorite sweater draped over the chair where he used to sit reading the newspaper. Her friends meant well when they suggested she start dating again. "You're only 22, her coworker Margaret would say during their lunch breaks at the factory. "Bobby wouldn't want you to spend your whole life waiting for a ghost." But Helen wasn't waiting for a ghost. She was waiting for answers. Every morning before work, she wrote letters to admirals, senators, newspaper editors, anyone who might have influence or information about the USS Tempest. She kept carbon copies of everything in a growing file box under her bed, organizing them by date and response. Most letters went unanswered. The ones that did receive replies offered the same hollow condolences and vague promises about ongoing investigations. Helen learned to read between the lines, to notice when officials avoided specific questions or used phrases like, "due to national security considerations." In March of 1944, she received an unexpected phone call from Mrs. Elizabeth Morrison in Seattle. Captain Morrison's wife had gotten Helen's address from another Navy family and wanted to compare notes about their missing men. "My husband wrote something strange in his last letter, Mrs. Morrison explained during their first conversation. "He mentioned carrying special cargo that made him nervous." "Did Bobby ever say anything like that?" Helen pulled out Bobby's final letter and read the relevant passage aloud. "He wrote about a special assignment and said the captain looked worried, like a man taking his dogs on a dangerous hunt." "That's exactly what William would have looked like," Mrs. Morrison said quietly. "He had that same expression before every difficult mission." The two women began corresponding regularly, sharing information and supporting each other through the long months of uncertainty. Mrs. Morrison had connections in Navy circles through her husband's career, while Helen had persistence and an organized mind that military bureaucrats found difficult to dismiss. Together, they discovered that the Tempest had been carrying more than just routine supplies. Through careful questioning of other Navy wives, they learned about mysterious crates loaded under heavy security, about sealed orders that couldn't be discussed, about radio silence requirements that prevented the ship from calling for help even in emergencies. By summer, their informal network had grown to include 12 families. Mrs. Kowalski in Oakland contributed what she'd learned from her husband's letters. Mrs. Chen in Los Angeles shared information from her brother who worked in Navy procurement. Each family added pieces to a puzzle that no one wanted them to solve. Helen started keeping a detailed timeline on her bedroom wall, connecting dates, locations, and personnel movements with colored string like detectives did in the movies. The pattern that emerged suggested the Tempest hadn't been on routine patrol at all, but had been carrying classified materials for the top-secret Manhattan project. "If we're right about this," Mrs. Morrison said during one of their weekend phone calls, "then our husbands died protecting secrets that could win the war. But why won't the Navy tell us that?" Helen stared at Bobby's photograph on her nightstand and wondered the same thing. The war ended on a Tuesday in August of 1945, and Helen Martinez watched the celebrations from her apartment window. Sailors kissed nurses in Times Square, confetti fell like snow, and church bells rang across San Diego. But in her quiet living room, Bobby's empty chair reminded her that not everyone was coming home. The official telegram arrived 2 weeks later, typed on crisp Navy letterhead with Admiral Nimitz's signature stamped at the bottom. "The Secretary of the Navy regrets to inform you that Seaman First Class Robert J. Mitchell, previously reported as missing in action, is now presumed dead in the service of his country." Helen read the words 3 times, but they didn't feel real. Presumed dead wasn't the same as confirmed dead. There was still no wreckage, no bodies, no explanation for what had happened to the USS Tempest and her crew of 186 men. Mrs. Morrison called that evening from Seattle, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "I got the same telegram. They're closing the case, Helen. After 2 years, they're just giving up." "They can't give up," Helen said, gripping the telephone receiver. "We still don't know what happened to them. The war's over. They have bigger things to worry about now." Helen understood the logic, but logic didn't ease the ache in her chest or answer the questions that kept her awake at night. She'd spent 2 years believing Bobby might walk through her door someday, with an incredible story about surviving on a remote island or being held in a Japanese prison camp. The telegram made that impossible dream feel foolish. The Navy offered her a widow's pension and death benefits, forms to sign that would make Bobby's absence official and final. Helen left them unsigned on her kitchen table for 3 months before finally filling them out. She needed the money, but signing felt like betraying Bobby's memory. Mrs. Chen organized a memorial service in November at the Naval Training Center Chapel. Families traveled from across the country to honor the men of the Tempest. Helen wore the blue dress Bobby had always loved and carried his last letter in her purse. The chaplain spoke about sacrifice and service, about young men who gave their lives for freedom. But Helen noticed what he didn't say. No mention of the mysterious cargo, no explanation for the radio silence, no acknowledgement that the Tempest might have been carrying secrets worth dying for. After the service, families gathered in small groups, sharing stories and photographs. Helen met Bobby's shipmates' relatives for the first time, putting faces to the names she'd heard in letters. Mrs. Kowalski brought pictures of baby James, who would never meet his father. Mr. Patterson showed everyone the Purple Heart his son had earned at Guadalcanal before transferring to the Tempest. As the families began to disperse, Returning to their scattered lives across America, Helen made a decision. The Navy might consider the case closed, but she wasn't ready to let go. Bobby's last letter had mentioned something important about their final mission, something the officials didn't want families to know. Helen was going to find out what that something was, even if it took the rest of her life. Helen Martinez had become an expert at government paperwork by 1953. Her kitchen table was covered with Freedom of Information Act requests, carbon copies of letters, and manila folders organized by date and department. At 30, she worked as a secretary at a law firm, skills that served her well in navigating military bureaucracy. The Freedom of Information Act had given families new power to demand answers from government agencies. Helen had filed dozens of requests about the USS Tempest, each one carefully worded to avoid triggering automatic denials for national security reasons. Most requests came back completely blacked out, pages of documents with every word covered in thick black ink, but Helen had learned to read between the redactions, to notice patterns in what was hidden and what was revealed. On a rainy Thursday morning, she received a package that changed everything. The return address showed it came from the Naval Archives in Washington, and inside were 47 pages of documents related to the Tempest's final mission. Helen spread the papers across her living room floor and began reading. The first page was the ship's manifest, showing routine supplies like ammunition, fuel, and food rations. Nothing unusual there, but the second page made her hands shake. Under a section labeled Special Cargo, someone had written Materials for Operation Trinity in neat handwriting. Below that, the page was heavily redacted, but Helen could make out partial words through the black ink. Enriched, Los Alamos, and Critical Mass were still visible, despite the censoring. Helen had heard whispers about Los Alamos during the war. Everyone knew it was some kind of secret research facility in New Mexico, connected to the atomic bombs that ended the war with Japan. If the Tempest had been carrying materials for atomic research, that would explain why the Navy had been so secretive about the mission. She called Mrs. Morrison in Seattle that evening, reading the documents over the phone word by word. Operation Trinity was the code name for the first atomic bomb test, Mrs. Morrison said quietly. My brother works for Boeing, and he's heard stories about ships that transported uranium and plutonium across the Pacific. They were under strict orders to maintain radio silence no matter what happened. That means Bobby and the others died protecting atomic secrets, Helen said, staring at Bobby's photograph on her mantel. They couldn't call for help because their cargo was too important, and the Navy couldn't launch a proper search because they didn't want anyone else finding that cargo first. Helen spent the weekend reading everything she could find about atomic research and the Manhattan Project. The more she learned, the more she understood why the Tempest had vanished so completely. The ship hadn't just been carrying supplies, it had been carrying the future of warfare itself. But understanding why didn't make the loss any easier. If anything, it made Helen angrier. Bobby had died serving his country, protecting secrets that helped win the war, and the Navy had repaid his sacrifice with lies and cover-ups. Helen carefully filed the documents in her growing collection and began planning her next move. The truth was still buried somewhere in those redacted pages, and she was going to find it. Dr. James Whitmore first heard about the USS Tempest while researching his doctoral thesis on Pacific theater mysteries at the University of California, San Diego in 1962. He'd been studying unexplained disappearances during World War II when he came across a brief mention in a declassified Navy report about a destroyer escort that had vanished without a trace. The case fascinated him immediately. Ships didn't just disappear, especially not in well-traveled shipping lanes with regular patrol schedules. Whitmore had spent 3 years studying maritime disasters, and he knew that even catastrophic explosions left debris fields. The complete absence of wreckage from the Tempest suggested something unusual had happened. He tried requesting official Navy records, but his academic credentials weren't enough to bypass the security classifications that still surrounded the case. Most documents remained sealed under national security provisions, leaving him with fragments and second-hand accounts. Then he remembered reading a newspaper article about families who'd formed support groups after the war. The article mentioned a woman named Helen Martinez who'd become something of an expert on the Tempest case through her own research. Whitmore found her address through the Veterans Administration and wrote her a careful letter explaining his academic interest. Helen's response arrived 2 weeks later, written in precise handwriting on personal stationery. She agreed to meet him at a coffee shop near the San Diego waterfront, warning him that she'd grown suspicious of anyone asking questions about Bobby and his shipmates. When Whitmore arrived at the designated cafe, he immediately recognized Helen from her determined expression and the manila folder she carried. At 39, she still moved with the purposeful energy of someone who hadn't given up fighting. "Dr. Whitmore?" she asked, extending her hand. "You said you're writing about Pacific mysteries. Why the Tempest specifically?" Whitmore explained his research, how the case had caught his attention because it didn't fit normal patterns of wartime losses. Helen listened carefully, asking pointed questions about his methodology and academic affiliations. "I've been studying this case for 17 years, she said finally, opening her folder to reveal dozens of documents. "I probably know more about the Tempest than anyone outside the Navy Department. The question is, what can you do that I haven't already tried?" Whitmore studied the papers she showed him, impressed by the thoroughness of her documentation. Helen had collected testimony from dock workers who'd loaded the mysterious cargo, tracked down former Navy personnel who'd worked in classified programs, and even obtained partial blueprints of the ship through Freedom of Information requests. "You have academic credentials," Helen continued. "Universities can sometimes get access to documents that private citizens can't, and you have time to travel, to interview people face to face." "Number 1. What would you want in return?" Whitmore asked. "The truth," Helen said simply. "Bobby Mitchell was a good man who died serving his country. He deserves better than being forgotten in some classified file." They shook hands across the coffee shop table, forming an unlikely partnership between a determined woman seeking answers about her lost love and a young scholar who specialized in solving historical mysteries. Neither realized they were beginning a 20-year investigation that would eventually change both their lives. The breakthrough came in 1976, when Dr. Whitmore received a call from a contact at the National Archives. Decades of secrecy surrounding atomic weapons programs were finally being lifted, and thousands of previously classified documents were being released to researchers and historians. "You're going to want to see this," the archivist told him over the phone. "We've got a whole file on something called the Pacific Materials Transport Program. Your ship, the Tempest, is mentioned by name." Whitmore drove to Washington immediately, calling Helen from a payphone at the airport to let her know about the development. She'd taken vacation time from her job at the insurance company where she now worked as a senior claims adjuster, her investigative skills having served her well in the business world. The documents waiting for them in the archives reading room told a story that was both thrilling and heartbreaking. The USS Tempest had indeed been carrying atomic materials, specifically enriched uranium destined for weapons testing in the Marshall Islands. But the cargo manifest revealed something even more significant. "Look at this," Helen whispered, pointing to a line item that had previously been completely redacted. "Prototype detonation device, Mark 7 configuration, serial number 47 Alpha." Whitmore felt his breath catch. They weren't just carrying uranium, they were transporting an actual atomic bomb. The Tempest had been carrying one of America's most precious and dangerous weapons when she disappeared. The operational orders, now partially declassified, explained the extreme secrecy. The bomb was a backup device for Operation Crossroads, the atomic tests planned for Bikini Atoll. If the primary weapons failed, the Tempest's cargo would serve as a replacement, ensuring the tests could proceed on schedule. "That's why they couldn't break radio silence," Helen said, her voice filled with a mixture of pride and anguish. Bobby and his shipmates were protecting an atomic weapon. If they'd called for help, and enemy forces had intercepted those transmissions. The Japanese or Soviets could have sent submarines to recover the bomb, Whitmore finished. The strategic implications would have been catastrophic. Further documents revealed that the Tempest's route had taken her through waters where Soviet submarine activity had been detected. Intelligence reports suggested that Russian forces were actively monitoring American atomic programs, trying to intercept materials and gather information about weapons development. The most devastating revelation came in a memo from Admiral Halsey to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The crew of USS Tempest demonstrated exceptional courage in maintaining operational security under extreme circumstances. Their sacrifice ensured that critical atomic materials did not fall into enemy hands. Recommend posthumous commendations for all personnel. Helen stared at the document for a long time, tears running down her cheeks. "They knew," she said quietly. "The Navy knew exactly what happened and why Bobby couldn't call for help. They've known for 30 years that those men died heroes. But they couldn't tell the families without revealing atomic secrets," Whitmore added. "Even the existence of the bomb on that ship was classified above top secret." Helen carefully made copies of every document they were allowed to photograph. After 33 years of searching, she finally understood why Bobby had to die in silence. Michael Martinez was born in 1947, 4 years after Bobby Mitchell had vanished in the Pacific. Helen had never married, but she'd adopted a baby whose young mother couldn't care for him. She named him Michael Robert Martinez, giving him Bobby's middle name and her own last name, raising him with stories about the sailor who would have been his father if fate had been kinder. Growing up, Michael had watched his mother spend countless evenings at the kitchen table, writing letters and organizing documents about the USS Tempest, Other kids had bedtime stories about princes and dragons. Michael fell asleep to tales about brave sailors and mysterious disappearances in the far Pacific. By 1983, Helen was 60 and her health was declining. Years of clerical work and emotional stress had taken their toll, and her doctor was concerned about her blood pressure. She'd turned her obsession with the Tempest into a methodical archive, but she was running out of energy to pursue new leads. "I'm not giving up," she told Michael one evening as they sorted through her files. "But I need someone younger to take over the search. Someone who can learn the new technologies they're developing for ocean exploration." Michael had always known this day would come. At 36, he was a successful engineer at General Dynamics, working on submarine design projects that had given him extensive knowledge about underwater systems and deep-sea operations. His mother's crusade had shaped his entire career path, though he'd never admitted it directly. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Michael said, though he already knew the answer. "Find the Tempest," Helen replied simply. "Find Bobby. Bring him home." Michael took a leave of absence from his job and enrolled in a marine archaeology program at Texas A&M University. The coursework covered underwater search techniques, deep-sea salvage operations, and the latest developments in sonar technology. His classmates were mostly young graduate students who called him the old man, but Michael's engineering background and practical experience made him one of the program's most capable students. During summer break, he worked with a commercial salvage company in the Gulf of Mexico, learning to operate remotely controlled vehicles and interpret sonar readings. The work was dangerous and technically demanding, but Michael found himself drawn to the challenge of finding lost objects in the vast underwater wilderness. Helen attended his graduation in 1986, proud but visibly frail. After the ceremony, they drove to the San Diego waterfront where she'd first met Dr. Whitmore 24 years earlier. "I've given you everything I know about the Tempest," she said, looking out at the Pacific horizon. "The documents, the witness statements, the coordinate estimates. Dr. Whitmore's research is in there too. Now it's your turn." Michael accepted the heavy box of files, feeling the weight of 43 years of investigation and determination. Somewhere beneath thousands of feet of Pacific water, Bobby Mitchell was waiting to be found. Michael intended to bring him home, fulfilling the promise his mother had made to a young sailor she'd loved and lost so many decades ago. Captain Yuki Tanaka had been fishing these waters for 23 years, and he'd never seen sonar readings like the ones appearing on his equipment in the spring of 1994. His commercial tuna boat, the Pacific Star, was working a promising area roughly 400 miles southwest of Guadalcanal when the fish finder began showing unusual returns from the ocean floor. "Hiroshi, come look at this," he called to his first mate, tapping the sonar screen with a weathered finger. "What do you make of these readings?" Hiroshi Yamamoto studied the display, frowning at the geometric shapes that appeared on the bottom scan. After 15 years of fishing, he could identify schools of fish, underwater ridges, even sunken logs by their sonar signatures. But this looked different, too regular and angular to be natural. "Could be a wreck," Hiroshi suggested. "Maybe something from the war." The readings showed a large metallic object approximately 300 feet long, sitting upright on the seafloor at a depth of 12,400 feet. The object cast a distinct shadow on the sonar display, suggesting it rose significantly above the surrounding ocean bottom. Captain Tanaka marked the coordinates in his navigation log and took several photographs of the sonar screen. He'd heard stories from other fishermen about finding World War II wrecks in these waters, and some of them had received salvage payments from governments interested in recovering historical artifacts. When the Pacific Star returned to port in Honiara, Tanaka contacted the Solomon Islands Maritime Authority to report his discovery. The official who took his report seemed interested but explained that investigating deep water wrecks required specialized equipment that wasn't available locally. "We'll forward your report to the appropriate authorities," the official promised. "If this is a wartime vessel, there may be international interest in the site." Word of Tanaka's discovery spread quickly through the Pacific maritime community. Commercial fishermen routinely shared information about underwater obstacles and fishing grounds, and several other captains began working the area, hoping to confirm the sonar readings. Over the next 2 years, 4 different fishing vessels reported similar contacts in the same general location. The coordinates varied slightly due to navigation uncertainties, but all the readings described a large metallic object on the deep ocean floor, far below the reach of conventional diving operations. In 1996, a Japanese oceanographic research vessel conducting surveys for the International Seabed Authority passed through the area and detected the same anomaly. Their sophisticated sonar equipment provided much more detailed readings, confirming that the object was definitely artificial and appeared to be a military vessel from the World War II era. The research vessel's report reached the offices of maritime historians and naval archives around the Pacific Rim. In San Diego, Michael Martinez received a phone call from Dr. Whitmore, now retired, but still monitoring developments related to Pacific War mysteries. "Michael, I think we may have found her," Dr. Whitmore said, his voice trembling with excitement. "A research ship has confirmed sonar contacts that match the size and configuration of a destroyer escort. The coordinates put it exactly where the Tempest should be, based on her last known position and probable drift patterns." Helen Martinez was 73 and in declining health, but when Michael showed her the sonar photographs, her eyes lit up with the same determination that had sustained her for over 50 years. Dr. Sarah Chen had revolutionized deep-sea exploration with her team at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. By 2001, her remotely operated vehicles could reach depths that had been impossible just a decade earlier, equipped with high-definition cameras and precision manipulator arms that worked like underwater hands. When Michael Martinez contacted her about investigating the sonar anomaly in the Pacific, Dr. Chen was immediately intrigued. She'd heard about the USS Tempest case from maritime archaeology circles, and the technical challenge of exploring a wreck at 12,000 feet appealed to her engineering background. "The depth isn't the main problem," she explained to Michael during their first meeting at Woods Hole. "We've got ROVs that can handle those pressures easily. The challenge is the distance from any support base and the cost of mounting an expedition to such a remote location." Michael had spent 15 years preparing for this moment. He'd saved every dollar from his engineering salary, taken out loans against his house, and even started a small consulting business to fund the search. Helen had left him a modest inheritance when she died in 1999, money she'd specifically earmarked for finding Bobby. "I can cover the expedition costs," Michael told Dr. Chen. "What I need is the right technology and expertise." Dr. Chen's latest ROV, nicknamed Deep Explorer, was a marvel of underwater engineering. The vehicle could operate for 12 hours at depths exceeding 15,000 feet, transmitting live video through a fiber optic tether while collecting detailed sonar maps and even recovering small artifacts. "If your ship is down there, Doctor," Chen said, studying the sonar images from the fishing boats, "Deep Explorer can find it and document everything. We can create a complete photographic record of the wreck site." The expedition required months of planning. They chartered a research vessel from the University of Hawaii, assembled a team of marine archaeologists and ROV technicians, and obtained permits from multiple Pacific nations for working in international waters. Michael insisted on including Dr. Whitmore in the expedition, despite the historian's advanced age. At 78, Whitmore moved slowly and tired easily, but his knowledge of the Tempest case was encyclopedic. "Helen would have wanted him there," Michael explained to Dr. Chen. "He's been part of this search longer than anyone except my mother." The most significant technological advance was the ROV's ability to transmit real-time video via satellite link. For the first time in deep-sea exploration history, people around the world could watch underwater discoveries as they happened. Michael arranged for Mrs. Morrison, now 82 and living in a Seattle nursing home, to watch the expedition through a live internet feed. As their research vessel Ocean Pioneer left Honolulu in March of 2003, Michael stood at the bow watching the Pacific horizon. Somewhere beneath 3 miles of dark water, Bobby Mitchell had been waiting for 60 years. "We're coming, Bobby," Michael whispered to the wind. "Helen never stopped believing we'd find you." The technology that had seemed impossible when Helen first started her search was finally ready to bring her sailor home. The research vessel Ocean Pioneer reached the search coordinates on March 15, 2003, after 5 days of sailing through increasingly rough Pacific swells. Michael Martinez stood on the bridge beside Dr. Chen, watching her team prepare the Deep Explorer ROV for its first descent to the ocean floor 12,000 feet below. "Weather window looks good for the next 6 hours, reported Captain Rodriguez, studying the latest satellite weather data. "After that, we're expecting 20-foot swells that could make ROV operations dangerous." Dr. Chen nodded, checking her equipment one final time. The Deep Explorer hung from its deployment crane like a mechanical spider, bristling with cameras, lights, and scientific instruments. A fiber optic cable would connect the vehicle to the surface, transmitting live video and allowing precise control even at crushing depths. "Michael, are you ready for this?" Dr. Chen asked quietly. "There's always a chance we won't find what we're looking for." Michael thought about Helen, who had died 4 years earlier, still believing Bobby was waiting somewhere in the Pacific depths. Her funeral had been attended by dozens of Tempest families, people who'd become extended family through their shared loss and determination. "She waited 60 years for this moment," Michael replied. "I'm ready." The first descent began at 8 a.m. local time. Dr. Chen operated the ROV from a control station filled with monitors and joysticks, while Michael and Dr. Whitmore watched the live video feed. The camera showed nothing but blue water growing darker as the vehicle descended. At 2,000 feet, the sunlight disappeared completely, leaving only the ROV's powerful lights to illuminate the underwater world. Strange deep-sea creatures drifted past the cameras, jellyfish, and squid that had never seen daylight. By 10 a.m., Deep Explorer reached the ocean floor. The bottom appeared as a moonscape of gray sediment and scattered rocks, unmarked by any signs of human presence. Dr. Chen began a systematic search pattern, following GPS coordinates to guide the ROV across the seafloor. "Sonar contact," announced her technician after 2 hours of searching. "Large metallic object, bearing 270 degrees, distance approximately 300 meters. Michael's heart raced as Dr. Chen piloted the ROV toward the contact. The video feed showed nothing but empty ocean bottom for several minutes. Then suddenly the lights illuminated something that didn't belong in nature. "There," Dr. Whitmore whispered, pointing at the screen. "Do you see it?" A dark shape emerged from the gloom, angular and artificial against the soft curves of the seafloor. As Deep Explorer moved closer, the object resolved into the unmistakable silhouette of a ship's hull, sitting upright on the bottom as if it had been gently placed there. "It's her," Michael said, his voice barely audible. "It's the Tempest." The destroyer escort sat intact on the ocean floor. Her superstructure collapsed, but her basic shape still recognizable. 60 years of deep ocean currents had covered parts of the hull with sediment, but the ship's number was still visible on her bow, DD 847. After 6 decades of searching, they had finally found Bobby Mitchell's ship. September 15, 2003, began like any other day aboard the research vessel Ocean Pioneer. But it would end as the most important day in Michael Martinez's life. Dr. Chen had been conducting systematic surveys of the wreck site for 3 months, mapping every section of the USS Tempest with methodical precision. "Today we're going inside, Doctor," Chen announced during the morning briefing. "The ROV has located what appears to be an intact opening in the ship's hull. We should be able to explore the interior compartments." Michael felt his hands trembling as he watched the Deep Explorer descend through the dark water toward the Tempest. The ship had become familiar to him over months of exploration, but they'd only examined the exterior. Today they would see where Bobby had lived and worked during his final months. Dr. Whitmore sat beside Michael in the control room, now 80 but still sharp enough to identify ship components from the video feed. "That opening leads to the crew quarters," he said, pointing at the screen. "If the interior is preserved like the outside, we might find personal belongings." Number 1. If you said Champley is a video, the ROV squeezed through a gap in the hull where an explosion had torn open the metal plating. Inside, the ship was a time capsule, frozen at the moment of sinking. Tables were still set in the mess hall, their contents scattered but recognizable. Cooking pots hung in the galley, and charts remained pinned to navigation tables. "The preservation is incredible," Dr. Chen murmured, maneuvering the vehicle through narrow corridors. "The cold temperature and lack of oxygen have prevented normal decay." As they explored deeper into the ship, the emotional weight of what they were seeing began to affect everyone in the control room. These weren't just artifacts from a sunken vessel. They were the final moments of 186 young men frozen in time. "There," Michael said suddenly, spotting something on the video feed. "That section, the sleeping quarters. Can you get closer?" Dr. Chen guided the ROV into what had been the crew's berthing area. Bunks lined the walls, and personal items were scattered throughout the compartment. The camera focused on one particular area where a sea bag was wedged between twisted metal. "The name tag," Dr. Whitmore said, leaning forward to read the small print on the screen. "Can you make out what it says?" Dr. Chen adjusted the ROV's lights and moved the camera closer. The fabric was stained and deteriorated, but black letters were still visible on a white name tape. "Mitchell, R.J." Michael's breath caught in his throat. After 60 years of searching, he was looking at Bobby's personal belongings, exactly where the young sailor had left them on that final morning in December 1943. "We found him," Michael whispered, tears streaming down his face. "We actually found him." The ROV's camera continued recording as Dr. Chen carefully documented Bobby's sleeping area. A photograph was wedged in the metal framework of his bunk, the image too deteriorated to make out clearly but obviously precious to its owner. "Helen," Michael said quietly, thinking of his mother, "I wish you could see this." The Deep Explorer ROV descended through the Tempest's twisted corridors like a mechanical ghost, its lights cutting through 60 years of darkness. Dr. Chen operated the controls with surgeon-like precision, navigating the vehicle through compartments that had become underwater tombs. "The ship's structure is remarkably intact," she reported, studying the sonar readings on her monitors. Whatever sank her didn't cause massive structural damage. This looks more like controlled flooding than an explosion. Michael watched the live video feed, mesmerized by the preserved details of daily life aboard a World War II destroyer escort. Coffee cups still sat on tables in the mess hall, their contents long since dissolved, but their positions suggesting the crew had been eating when disaster struck. Doctor. Whitmore pointed at something on the screen. Look at that bulletin board. The papers are still pinned up. If we could read those, they might tell us what the crew knew about their final mission. The ROV's high-definition cameras captured every detail as Dr. Chen methodically explored each accessible compartment. In the radio room, equipment was still mounted in its original positions. The engine room showed signs of flooding, with debris scattered in patterns that suggested rapid water intake. Here's something interesting, Doctor, Chen said, maneuvering the ROV toward what appeared to be a sealed compartment. This section shows blast damage, but it's contained, almost like something exploded inside this specific area. The damaged compartment was near the ship's center, in an area that would have been used for cargo storage. Twisted metal and debris blocked most of the opening, but the ROV's cameras could see into the space beyond. That's where they kept the special cargo, Michael said, remembering the declassified documents his mother had obtained decades earlier. The atomic materials. Through the opening, they could see scattered metal containers and what appeared to be lead-lined boxes, their contents long since compromised by seawater, but their purpose unmistakable. The Tempest had indeed been carrying atomic materials when she sank. The radiation levels down here would be negligible after 60 years, Dr. Chen explained. Whatever was in those containers has been diluted by millions of gallons of seawater. As they continued exploring, a more personal picture emerged of the ship's final moments. In the captain's quarters, charts were spread across the navigation table, showing their intended route through the Solomon Islands. The final course corrections were still visible in pencil markings on the maps. They were trying to reach a rendezvous point, Dr. Whitmore observed, studying the chart markings visible on the video feed. But something went wrong before they could get there. The most haunting discovery came in the communications center, where the radio equipment remained in perfect condition. The final message log was still open on the operator's desk, its last entry visible through the ROV's camera. Cargo compromised, maintaining radio silence per standing orders. God help us all. Michael stared at those words, understanding finally that Bobby and his shipmates had died following orders, even when those orders meant they couldn't call for help. They'd chosen duty over survival, protecting atomic secrets even as their ship sank beneath them. The Deep Explorer's robotic arm moved with delicate precision as Dr. Chen attempted to recover items from Bobby Mitchell's sleeping area. The water pressure at 12,000 feet could crush a human body instantly, but the ROV's mechanical systems were designed to work in this alien environment. I can see something wedged behind his sea bag, Dr. Chen reported, adjusting the vehicle's position for a better angle. It looks like a small package wrapped in oilcloth. Michael leaned closer to the monitor, his heart pounding as the ROV's manipulator arm carefully extracted the object from its resting place. After 60 years underwater, the oilcloth had deteriorated but still provided some protection for whatever was inside. The preservation is extraordinary, Dr. Whitmore commented. That oilcloth was standard Navy issue for protecting personal documents and valuables. Using the ROV's collection basket, Dr. Chen secured the package along with several other items from Bobby's area. A metal cup with his initials scratched into the bottom, a small Bible with a leather cover, and what appeared to be a fountain pen still clipped to a deteriorated notebook. As they moved through other sections of the crew quarters, more personal belongings emerged from the depths. Tommy Kowalski's bunk yielded a photograph of a young woman holding a baby, the image miraculously preserved in a waterproof frame. In another compartment, they found a harmonica, several letters sealed in bottles, and a chess set with pieces still arranged on the board. Every item tells a story, Michael said, watching the recovery operation with growing emotion. These men weren't just names on a casualty list. They were sons, husbands, fathers. Dr. Chen's team worked methodically through the accessible areas of the ship, documenting and recovering personal effects with archaeological precision. Each item was photographed in its original position before being carefully extracted and stored in the ROV's collection chambers. The most poignant discovery came in the ship's mailroom, where dozens of letters were found in various stages of preservation. Some had been sealed in waterproof pouches. Others were barely legible after decades underwater, but all represented final connections between the crew and their families back home. This is what Helen was really searching for, Michael realized, watching the letters being recovered. Not just proof that Bobby existed, but evidence of who he was, what he cared about, how he lived his final days. Among the letters they found several addressed to Helen Martinez in San Diego, letters Bobby had written but never had the chance to mail. The envelopes were stained and partially deteriorated, but Helen's name and address were still clearly visible in Bobby's familiar handwriting. "He was thinking about her right up to the end," Dr. Whitmore said quietly. The recovery operation continued for 3 days, with each shift bringing new discoveries from the Tempest's interior. By the time they'd exhausted the accessible areas, the ROV's collection chambers contained hundreds of personal items representing the lives and dreams of the ship's crew. "Tomorrow we bring Bobby home," Michael said as the final recovery dive ended. "After 60 years, we're finally bringing them all home." The ROV's lights illuminated Bobby Mitchell's sleeping area with startling clarity, revealing a personal space that had remained untouched for 60 years. Dr. Chen positioned the Deep Explorer carefully, avoiding the twisted metal that had collapsed when the ship sank, while Michael stared at the video monitor with tears in his eyes. Bobby's bunk was exactly as he'd left it on December 3, 1943. A thin navy blanket was still folded at the foot of the narrow bed, and his sea bag hung from a hook on the bulkhead, its canvas material darkened by decades of seawater but still intact. "Can you see inside the bag?" Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Chen maneuvered the ROV's camera closer, adjusting the lights to peer into the partially open sea bag. The first thing visible was a small leather portfolio, the kind sailors use to protect important documents and photographs from salt air and moisture. "There's something metallic in there too," Dr. Chen observed, operating the robotic arm to carefully open the bag wider. "It's reflecting our lights." As the manipulator arm gently moved aside some deteriorated clothing, a small object became visible wedged in the bottom of the bag. Even through the murky water and video feed, its significance was unmistakable. It was a ring, a simple gold band with a small diamond that caught the ROV's lights like a tiny star. "The engagement ring," Michael breathed. Helen always wondered if he'd bought one. Dr. Whitmore leaned forward, studying the screen intently. He carried it with him for months, waiting for the right moment to propose. She never knew. The ROV's camera revealed more treasures as Dr. Chen continued the careful examination. Tucked beside the ring was a photograph of Helen, the same picture that had sat on her dresser for decades. In the photo, she was young and radiant, wearing the blue dress Bobby had mentioned in his letters. "Look at the back of the photograph," Dr. Chen said, adjusting the camera angle. Faded handwriting was visible on the reverse side. "To Bobby, all my love forever, Helen." The leather portfolio contained letters, dozens of them, carefully preserved in the waterproof case. Some were from Helen, others from Bobby's family. But at the very bottom was something unexpected, a letter in Bobby's own handwriting that had never been sent. "It's addressed to Helen," Michael observed, reading the envelope through the video feed. "Dated December 2, 1943, the day before they disappeared." Dr. Chen worked with painstaking care to recover each item from Bobby's sea bag. The engagement ring came up first, still brilliant despite its underwater ordeal. Then, the photograph, the letters, and finally the unsent letter that Bobby had written on his final night. "He was going to propose when he got home," Michael said, thinking of all the years Helen had waited, never knowing how much Bobby had truly loved her. She spent her whole life wondering if he would have married her. The answer had been waiting in Bobby's bunk for 60 years, a promise preserved in the depths of the Pacific Ocean. The ship's bridge had been Dr. Chen's primary target from the beginning of the expedition. If any answers about the Tempest's final hours existed, they would be found in Captain Morrison's quarters and the navigation center where the ship's official records were kept. The ROV squeezed through a gap in the bridge superstructure, its lights revealing a scene of organized chaos. Charts were scattered across the navigation table, and the ship's compass still pointed magnetic north after 6 decades underwater. But the most important discovery was the captain's safe, its heavy steel door slightly ajar. The pressure change when the ship sank must have damaged the locking mechanism, Dr. Chen explained as she maneuvered the robotic arm toward the safe. "Whatever's inside should be well preserved." The safe contained the ship's official logbook, wrapped in oilcloth and stored in a waterproof container. Beside it was Captain Morrison's personal journal, a leather-bound book that he'd kept separate from the official records. Michael watched nervously as the ROV's delicate manipulators extracted both books. These documents would contain the truth about the Tempest's final mission, the answers that Helen had sought for 60 years. Back on the surface, the recovery team worked in a sterile environment to carefully open and preserve the waterlogged documents. The ship's log was written in the precise, formal language required by Navy regulations, but Captain Morrison's personal journal revealed the human story behind the official entries. December 1, 1943, Dr. Whitmore read aloud from the captain's journal, "Cargo loaded under maximum security protocols. Admiral's orders are clear. Maintain radio silence regardless of circumstances. The men don't understand why we can't communicate with other ships, but I know what we're carrying. One mistake could change the course of the war. The entries continued with growing tension as the ship approached its destination. Captain Morrison had been increasingly worried about the weather and the stability of his classified cargo. December 2nd. Heavy seas developing. The special cargo containers are shifting despite additional restraints. Chief Engineer reports stress fractures in the hull near the cargo hold. If those containers break loose, the radiation shielding could be compromised. Michael felt his hands trembling as he read the final entries. The captain had known they were in danger but couldn't break radio silence to request assistance or change course. December 3rd, 400 hours. Cargo containment failure. Radiation levels in forward compartments exceed safe limits. Water is entering through hull breaches caused by shifting containers. Engineering reports we have. Maybe 6 hours before critical flooding. The last entry was written in a shaking hand as the ship was already going down. 800 hours. All hands performing magnificently. No panic, no complaints about orders that prevent us from calling for help. These boys understand duty. If we don't make it home, I want their families to know they died as heroes, protecting secrets that will help America win this war. The atomic materials are secured. Enemy forces will never recover them. Mission accomplished. Captain Morrison had chosen to follow orders even when those orders meant certain death for his entire crew. The most devastating revelation came from Captain Morrison's personal effects, recovered from his locked desk drawer in the ship's cabin. Among his papers was a sealed envelope marked, "To be opened only in case of my death," containing a detailed account of the Tempest's true mission. Dr. Whitmore's hands shook as he read the captain's final confession aloud to Michael and the research team. The cargo we carry is not just atomic materials. We are transporting a fully assembled nuclear device, designation Fat Man Mark III, serial number 47 Alpha. If this weapon falls into enemy hands, it could change the balance of the entire war. Michael sat in stunned silence as the implications became clear. The USS Tempest hadn't been carrying uranium or research materials. They'd been transporting an actual atomic bomb, one of only a handful that existed in 1943. The orders came directly from Admiral Halsey, Dr. Whitmore continued reading. Under no circumstances are we to break radio silence, even in case of emergency. The security of this weapon takes precedence over the safety of this ship and crew. If capture appears imminent, we are authorized to scuttle the vessel rather than allow enemy recovery of the device. Captain Morrison's journal entries revealed the terrible choice he'd faced in the ship's final hours. When the cargo containers began leaking radiation and causing hull damage, he could have broken radio silence to request immediate evacuation. Rescue ships could have reached them within hours. Instead, he'd chosen to follow orders, knowing that radio transmissions might be intercepted by enemy submarines operating in the area. Soviet and Japanese forces were actively searching for American atomic secrets, and any hint about the Tempest's cargo could have brought enemy vessels racing to the scene. "Look at this entry," Michael said, pointing to a passage near the end of the captain's account. He estimates they had 12 hours to abandon ship safely, but he kept them at their posts to ensure the atomic device sank in deep water where no one could ever recover it. The most heartbreaking discovery was a letter Captain Morrison had written to the families of his crew, explaining their sacrifice. These young men died protecting America's most precious military secret. They could have saved themselves, but they chose to stay with their ship and ensure that atomic weapons technology remained in American hands. History will remember them as heroes who helped win the war, even though that history must remain classified for generations. Dr. Chen found additional evidence in the ship's radio room, where the final transmission log showed repeated attempts by other Navy vessels to contact the Tempest. Ships had been nearby, ready to provide assistance, but Captain Morrison had maintained radio silence even as his vessel sank beneath him. "Bobby and his shipmates died following orders," Michael said quietly, thinking of all the years Helen had wondered why no rescue attempt had been made. They chose duty over survival because they believed their sacrifice would save American lives. The truth was both more heroic and more tragic than anyone had imagined. The crew of the USS Tempest had died protecting the atomic secrets that would end World War II, taking those secrets with them to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. The recovery operation began at dawn on October 15, 2004, exactly 61 years after Bobby Mitchell had written his last letter home. Michael stood on the deck of the research vessel Ocean Pioneer, watching Dr. Chen's team prepare the specialized equipment needed to bring human remains up from 12,000 feet below. The Navy had finally granted permission for the recovery after months of legal negotiations. Admiral Richardson, representing the current Pacific Fleet Command, had personally apologized to Michael for the decades of secrecy that had prevented earlier closure for the families. The classified nature of their mission kept us from honoring these men properly, Admiral Richardson had explained during their meeting in San Diego. It's time to bring them home. Dr. Chen's recovery capsule descended slowly through the dark water, guided by precise GPS coordinates to Bobby's sleeping area aboard the Tempest. The operation required delicate work, as 60 years of silt and marine growth had to be carefully removed to access the crew quarters. Michael watched the live video feed as the robotic arms began their careful excavation. Bobby's remains were found exactly where they expected, in his bunk where he'd apparently been sleeping when the ship went down. The cold, oxygen-poor environment of the deep Pacific had preserved more than anyone had hoped. "We're bringing up personal effects first, Doctor," Chen reported, her voice steady and professional despite the emotional weight of the moment. "The engagement ring, the photographs, and the unsent letter are all secure." The recovery capsule made multiple trips, bringing up not just Bobby's remains but those of several other crew members whose families had requested burial on land. Tommy Kowalski would finally meet his son, now a grandfather himself. Chief Ramirez would be laid to rest beside his wife in Texas. When the recovery capsule broke the surface for the final time, Michael felt 60 years of searching come to an end. The remains were transferred to military transport containers with full honors, American flags draped over each one as a Navy honor guard stood at attention. The most emotional moment came when Michael opened the waterproof container holding Bobby's personal effects. The engagement ring sparkled as brightly as the day Bobby had bought it with 3 months' pay. Helen's photograph was perfectly preserved, her young face smiling across the decades. But it was the unsent letter that brought tears to Michael's eyes. Written in Bobby's careful handwriting on December 2, 1943, it contained the proposal Helen had never received. "My dearest Helen," the letter began, "tomorrow we reach our destination, and I hope to be home for Christmas. I've been carrying something special for you, a ring that represents all my dreams for our future together. When this war is over, I want you to be my wife. I want us to buy that little house in Coronado and fill it with children and laughter." Michael carefully refolded the letter, understanding finally why his mother had never stopped believing Bobby would come home. In a way, he finally had. The USS Tempest would remain on the ocean floor, designated as a war grave, but her crew was coming home at last. Helen Martinez died peacefully in her sleep on January 21, 2006, 3 months after Bobby's remains were recovered from the Pacific depths. She was 83 years old and had spent 63 years waiting for the sailor who promised to marry her when the war ended. Michael found her that morning in her bedroom, Bobby's engagement ring on her finger and his final letter spread open on her nightstand. She'd read it dozens of times since he'd brought it to her from the expedition, memorizing every word of the proposal that had taken 60 years to deliver. The funeral was held at Mount Soledad Veterans Memorial, overlooking San Diego Bay, where Helen could see the Pacific horizon she'd watched for so many decades. Hundreds of people attended, including surviving members of Tempest families who'd become Michael's extended family through their shared search for answers. Admiral Richardson represented the Navy, presenting Michael with a folded American flag and a long-overdue letter of commendation for Helen's service to military families. "Your mother never stopped fighting for the truth," he said quietly. "The Navy owes her a debt that can never be repaid." Dr. Chen had flown in from Woods Hole, bringing with her a photo album documenting the Tempest expedition. She would have loved seeing these images, Dr. Chen told Michael. Proof that her sailor was exactly where she always believed he would be, waiting for her to find him. Mrs. Morrison, now 91 and confined to a wheelchair, had made the trip from Seattle for the service. She was the last surviving member of the original support group Helen had formed in the 1940s. "We promised each other we'd never give up," she whispered to Michael. Helen kept that promise until the very end. The most poignant moment came when Michael read aloud from Bobby's unsent letter, the proposal Helen had never heard but somehow always known was coming. "When this war is over, I want you to be my wife. I want us to buy that little house in Coronado and fill it with children and laughter. I love you more than all the stars reflected in the Pacific, and I promise to spend every day of our marriage making you as happy as you've made me." As the service concluded, a Navy honor guard fired a 21-gun salute over the bay where Bobby's ship had once been based. Taps echoed across the hillside while military jets flew overhead in missing man formation, honoring both the sailor who died in the depths and the woman who'd never stopped believing he'd come home. Michael buried Helen wearing Bobby's engagement ring and holding his final letter. In her other hand, he placed a small vial of sand from the beach where they'd first met in 1942, completing a love story that had spanned 2 lifetimes and 3 generations. At the graveside, Michael made a final promise to his mother. The USS Tempest would be designated a permanent war memorial, ensuring that Bobby Mitchell and his shipmates would never be forgotten again.